You need to make sure that you have the handout on Yachilan. Okay? Okay, great. So, once you've done that, I'm going to assume that this video is going to be stopped and then you're going to come back. So, now that you're back, let's jump right into a really quick review of this unit. In this unit, we covered the ancient Near East, ancient Egypt, and the indigenous Americas. And it's a lot of information, it's a lot of content, but I'm going to give you some strategies for remembering the information. The number one strategy for you is to make sure that you understand the religious beliefs and practices and the mythological stories that these people tell. If you can figure out what the stories that these people are telling are, then what you can do is you can take the buildings, you can take the various figures that they've created, sculpture and paintings, and you can work them all together into one nice little package. Let's go ahead and look at an example of that. So, when we study the ancient Near East, one of the things that we talk about is the White Temple, which is obviously this piece here, and the votive figures. We need to figure out, when we talk about the beliefs and practices of the Sumerian people, we want to remind ourselves that the votive figures would have been in the White Temple, which would have sat on top of the ziggurat, and that the ziggurat was a sacred place, right? And so you're building the narrative, you're telling this story, and once you've got the story constructed, then you can remind yourself the role that these votive figures played in the worship of a particular god. So inside this particular temple, it was dedicated to Anu. There would have been a cult statue. The cult statue probably would have been made of marble. It would have had gold and alabaster and probably eyes, jewels in the eyes to make it look incredibly realistic. And it would have sat on one side of that temple, and the votive figures would have been praying to it on the other side. So as soon as we figure that out, as soon as we remember that, we can put these two pieces together and we have more information. How do we stick this piece in with that? I think one of the ways that we can stick this piece in with that is remind ourselves that this Sumerian box, right, the Standard of Ur, had two sides, one dedicated to peace, which is this side here, dedicated to peace, and one dedicated to war. On the peace side, you had people engaging in offerings to a king, who we could tell was a king because in the way in which he breaks through registers. I want to stop for just a moment and remind you that it's really important that you remember the vocabulary that we've gone through. So take a moment right now, pause the video, write down as many vocabulary words you would associate with these pieces as you possibly can. Stop the video and do it right now. Seriously. If you don't stop the video and do it, then you're not going to get any practice. So stop the video and do it right now. Okay, you're back, and you're watching me write down some of the words that we know that we need to know. That's not going to work. Let's go back here. So registers, hierarchical scale. We talked about the use of alabaster, the blue material, which is a vocabulary word, right? Lapis lazuli, or lazuli. Lazuli. We have alabaster in these two, right? We need to remember those words. Hierarchical scale could also be called hieratic scale. So, anyway, getting back to this, we remind ourselves that the Sumerians utilize pieces like this to remind the viewer of the value of peace when a ruler is being properly honored and worshipped, in the same way that the gods need to be properly honored and worshipped. And we know that in Sumerian society there's this very clear connection between kingship, which we associate with this piece, and the worship of the gods, which we associate with this piece, which is to say that kings were oftentimes thought of as a priest of sorts, which brings us to our next series of pieces, the Babylonians. In my other review video, go back to that review video and do that review video if you haven't seen that already. It's the one that where we do the comparative analysis of the different cultures. I talk a lot about Hammurabi's code. Here, we know and we want to remind ourselves that even though this is Babylonians utilize cuneiform from the Sumerians. They utilize symbolism from the Sumerians, iconographic representations of a... I just lost my train of thought. The iconographic representation with the stair steps here of a ziggurat, the multi-tiered bullhorn crown, the notion of the king as a priest, right, or a sort of priest king, who gains his power of statesmanship from the worship of the god. Here we've got a Neo-Assyrian Lamassu, and I want to remind you guys that once again, in the same Mesopotamian area, the ancient Near East, we're utilizing similar symbols, the bull-headed crown. So for us to remember this story is to remind ourselves that there's a series of concepts and ideas that are routinely utilized from one culture to the next, from the Sumerians to the Babylonians to the Neo-Assyrians, all the way into when we get to the Persians. And the Persians utilize a lot of those same things. So for example, we've got the bulls being utilized here. We've got the utilization of these large columns. Remember, the outside of the doorways would have had Lamassu-like figures. Remember that on the front of these, the Apodonic gates, there would have been figures lining up to give worship to the king, right? In the same way that you see that in the Standard of Ur. So when you build up this base by studying the Sumerians, you have a better understanding of the Babylonians, the Neo-Assyrians, and the Persians. To understand the Persians, you have to go back and look at the other three cultures, because the Persians ultimately utilized and syncretized. Syncretize comes from syncretism. Sounds a little bit like synchronicity or synchronize, right? And that's what they're doing. They're synchronizing Assyrian, Babylonian, and Sumerian beliefs, which makes it easier to conquer and control those people. Now that's a lot like what we talked about when we talked about the angel and the arquebus, and the Spanish conquering the Inca and utilizing Incan symbolism to convert the people to Catholicism. We also see that with things like the Santo Domingo built on top of the Coricancha. We see that with the cathedral in Mexico City built on top of the Templo Mayor. Right? Okay, excellent. Moving on to ancient Egypt, and I know that we're already 8 minutes in, so I'm going to try and do this much faster. I want to remind you guys to separate the Old Kingdom from the New Kingdom. In the Old Kingdom, we have very, very, very traditional works of art that indicate the power of the pharaoh as a god, right? So the utilization of the white crown and the red crown, and the utilization of the falcon of Horus, which is the sky god, and making the connection between him and the pharaoh. The utilization of these massive pyramids to ensure the afterlife of the pharaoh, which would have been decorated with a whole assortment of statuary, right? Which the Ka, someone wrote on the board in 4th period the Ma, I wanted to correct that right now, which the Ka, which is the soul of the pharaoh, could inhabit these images. The burial of important people like scribes in these sites, in the pyramids, to ensure that every word that Menkaure, in this case, or Khafre, or Khufu said would be written down for the future, right? The utilization of images like this to remind us of the power of the pharaoh. This is Khafre's image as a sphinx, which is part lion. We see with the Lamassu the utilization of the lion-type figure, right? Let's see here. Going into the New Kingdom, we focus really on temples, the Temple of Hatshepsut and the Temple of Amun-Re. My advice to you is to really focus on what is the connection between these two temples. Think about the ceremony that Hatshepsut had utilizing the cult statue from the interior of the Temple of Amun-Re, right, which was ultimately a temple dedicated to the cult of the sun. And if you remember, she would have ultimately been kneeling to that cult statue of Amun-Re, which once a year would have been moved across the river to the Temple of Hatshepsut to stand in front of Hatshepsut so she could worship them. If you remember how those things worked together, then you really have, in some ways, one big series of beliefs and practices with pieces that sort of capture that history and that idea. I want to take a moment to remind you guys that in the middle of the New Kingdom, there was a sort of breakout period under Akhenaten where he creates a monotheistic religion, and the 1,000-year-old traditions of representation and the way in which power is represented and the way in which people are represented is thrown out temporarily, right? And so with the change of monotheism in Egypt comes a stylistic change, and the stylistic change helps us to remember the change to monotheistic belief. Monotheistic. Whoop, I knew that was going to happen. Beliefs. So keep that in mind. keep in mind what it is that they're doing here. Keep in mind who these people are, Akhenaten, Nefertiti, and daughters, right? Remember what the Amarna period is, and remember that the Amarna style is the idea of this new style, right? We know that they're no longer using idealism, right? Idealism is the idea of making someone appear perfect. The good example of idealism is to compare Akhenaten in this image to Menkaure in his image. And then last but not least, in the generations after Akhenaten, his son Tutankhamun, whose tomb was found, we want to remember what the crook and the flail and wedget and the symbols on his hood are, the beard, Horus. We want to be able to tell all of these sort of symbols. Same thing here. We want to be able to read this. If you haven't done so, my suggestion to you is that you go into the textbook, because the textbook does a really great job, and identify who is this, who is this, what is this, who is that, what's going on here, who's this, who's this. Make sure you know who Nefer is, make sure you know who Osiris is, make sure you know exactly what is happening in this scene. Okay? And don't forget to connect this to the larger funerary practices that we associate with the New Kingdom. Okay? Moving on to the Indigenous Americas. If you need to review one of these series of pieces, my suggestion to you is to go back to the videos that we did, go back to the fill in the blanks that we did, because our classmates actually did a really good job with these. So use that as a way of reviewing. Make sure you have the flashcards for these. Make sure that when you're looking at Chavinda Hontar that you're not just looking at one thing. You're not just looking at the relief sculpture. You're not just looking at the lands on stela, but you're also thinking about the nose ornament in order to build a complex idea of the beliefs and practices for these people. Same here with Yachilan. Make sure that you're not just using the structures, but that you're also using the lintels to help you understand the history that is being told, as well as the specific religious practices that are being engaged in, right? The ritual bloodletting. Make sure that you can differentiate between the Aztecs and the Mayans. Make sure you can differentiate. We talked about who gets sacrificed, winners versus losers, which one's which, right? Make sure that when you're talking about the Templo Mayor, that you're able to include in the Templo Mayor Moctezuma's headdress, right? What role would Moctezuma have played in the sacrifice at the Templo Mayor? Make sure you know who the people are. Huitzilopochtli, Coyolxauhqui, Tlaloc, right? You want to know who these people are. You want to know what they stood for, what they represented, and you want to remember that you can include all of these other things like the Coyolxauhqui stone, the Aztec calendar. All of that is included in your understanding of the Templo Mayor, along with like the Olmec mask and things like that, right? I like to connect the Olmec mask with the Aztec calendar, because it tells us that very clearly the Aztecs were thinking about the past ages of people who had been here, and in that sense, the calendar does that, but the Olmec mask also reminds us of the way in which the Aztecs engaged in some kind of archaeology. I'm not entirely sure what. Moving on to the Coricancha and the Machu Picchu, I think it's really important to remember that these are both Incan religious spiritual sites. This is the capital of their empire. This is the major religious site. Coricancha was one of the most holy places in all of the Incan capital, but this was the spiritual retreat for the royal family. So being able to tell the difference. Both of these are ultimately dedicated to the sun. The Coricancha was a sun temple dedicated to the sun. Machu Picchu was a place kind of similar to the Aztec calendar, utilizing not only worship, but also telling time and watching the movements of the sun and things like that. So again, if you need the review for those, go back through those and do that, because it's really important that you guys know that information. Tomorrow on the test, I want to talk about a little bit of what we're going to be doing. Because I'm not here today, we're not going to take the test today. Right? Because two reasons. Number one, we need more time to review. Number two, I can't check your form, function, content, context pages for your 5 flash cards. So on Friday, I'm going to end up doing 10 on the 5 on the Indigenous Americas, and 5 preferably on Greece. I hope you watch this video so that you know that. Right? So 10 times. Mind you guys of when you take the test, we are going to be doing a couple things. We're going to be utilizing multiple images for a set of questions, and you're going to end up writing specifically about beliefs and practices and sacred spaces. Okay, you're going to be writing about beliefs and practices and sacred spaces. Those things should go together in your mind, right? Sacred spaces are the place where you engage in your religious beliefs and practices, right? So when we think about the sacred space of the Templo Mayor, what are the beliefs and practices associated with that sacred space? When we think about the sacred space of the Coricancha or the Machu Picchu, what are the beliefs and practices associated? You finish this video and you have more time, watch other videos like my video, my other review video doing the comparative studies, or the videos that your classmates made. One more thing before I go, I want to remind you guys that at the end of this period, you need to make sure that you put everything back very carefully. You need to show whoever's in this room, the substitute, whatever, that you are taking care of everything. Again, put your Chromebooks in the right slot, make sure it's in the right number, make sure that the power cord is facing upwards on the top, make sure that you wrap your mice up, make sure that you take care of your headphones, and the other thing I want you to do is I want to make sure that you're taking care of the room around you, your desks are in the right place, you're cleaning up any trash off the floor, and ultimately making sure that this place looks as nice as it did when you came in. Hopefully it looked nice when you came in, and hopefully it will stay that way. I'm going to hold you guys responsible for that, so make sure that you make everything look great. Thank you guys. See you tomorrow.